Right. Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening for the American Head and Neck Society virtual education series. Tonight, our topic is navigating research in the era of generative artificial intelligence, real-world data, and deep fakes, ethical considerations, and pitfalls. And I think this is very prescient after our recent AHNS meeting, where the theme was very much centered around artificial intelligence. And all of us are submitting various research articles, and there's a lot to navigate here. So, my name is Robert Brody. I'm at the University of Pennsylvania, and we have Dr. Jeffrey Liu as well. We're going to be moderating this session. We have a great set of panelists here today, and I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Liu to help kick things off.
Thank you, Rob. It's very exciting to see this topic being presented since given everything going on. This presentation is also sponsored by a number of services from the American Head and Neck Society, the Population Health Clinical Research Service, the Basic Science Translational Service. It was a combined effort, as well as with the Artificial Intelligence Task Force, which was working under the president of AHNS, and also the Ethics and Professionalism Service. So multiple services came together to put this webinar together. I'm going to go with this. There are four speakers today. Are Dr. Andy Schumann, who's an associate professor in the Department of Otolaryngology at the University of Michigan. Dr. Sujith Baliga, who is an assistant professor of radiation oncology at The Ohio State University. Dr. Patrick Ha, who is the Erwin Mark and Joan Klein Jacobs Distinguished Professor in the Department of Otolaryngology at University of California, San Francisco. And finally, Dr. Xiaojing Wang, who's a professor and endowed chair of experimental pathology, Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine at UC Davis. Our speakers not only have background in these subjects that we'll be discussing today, but also some roles in the editorial staff of major journals, which will also be relevant for some of the topics. So, without further ado, Dr. Andy Schumann will start with the first part of the presentation to get us set up. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Jeff and Dr. Brody. Can you see my slides? Everything come out? Okay, great. So my task for the next few minutes is really just to set the scene in terms of some basics of research ethics, and that is what I plan to do today. So I am not here to represent the government, although I do have some federal funding and government roles that are relevant. So three quick points that I'll make over the next few minutes. The first is that clinical care and clinical research are governed, regulated, and conducted differently. The second is that surgical innovation and research overlap but are not synonymous. And the third is that the current political landscape, regardless of any political leanings that you may have, is influencing the research sphere in ways that are relevant to who we are and what we do. So why is clinical research different? The basic underpinnings of this is the fact that clinical research, by definition, is designed to help populations and to create generalizable knowledge for future patients, whereas clinical care is driven by the need and the obligation to take the best possible care of the patient in front of us. What that means in practice is that experimentation and research are different. Research, experimentation, and therapeutic clinical care all are distinct components with distinct goals and outcomes, whether you're using AI, randomized controlled trials, or any other type of research. So when we are treating patients and turning them into participants or subjects, there's an inherent vulnerability to those individuals that is governed by the fact that the outcome of their clinical care, while obviously important, is no longer the primary outcome or goal of the underlying trial. Because again, the goal of that is to create generalizable knowledge. With that said, the primacy of the patient best interest and outcome is still a key component of this. In practice, that means that the ethics of research and the ethics of therapeutic medicine are very similar in some ways, but also very different in others. And Miller and Brody have written about this in a really prescient way many, many years ago, but in ways that are still very relevant to precision oncology and the work that we're talking about today with AI and other technologies. So again, to hammer that home, clinical care, primacy of the patient's best interest and preference, clinical research, a hypothesis-driven effort to create generalizable knowledge. while obviously not harming patients in the way of doing so. So patient-centered treatment is focused on that therapeutic benefit, whereas a clinical trial or a research endeavor is designed to create that generalizable knowledge in ways that are driven by a protocol, in ways that are not necessarily as easily modulated for individual patient outcome. The way we regulate these is also very different. In clinical care, we generally do what's best and use our best judgment, whereas in research, we are really following a different set of rules that are set by CFR through the federal government. The executive branch through HHS of the federal government empowers individual IRBs to take the best care to protect the best interests of vulnerable subjects when we are putting them in protocols that are not designed specifically for their best interest. Similarly, when bad things happen in clinical care, of course, there are legal liabilities, both civil and criminal, of course. But in research, simply breaching a protocol, even if nothing bad happens to a patient, can get folks in trouble in different ways and in different circumstances. But the protocol breach itself is something that could lead to penalties and consequences in research, whereas that's fundamentally different than clinical care. And that applies to clinical trials as well as other forms of research. So the way we deal with this is that clinical informed consent is focused on all of these differences from the standpoint of individual patients and clinicians. And then on the research side is driven by the concept of equipoise, that we are basically doing an experiment to figure out what is best. And while we need a proportional level of benefit and risk acceptance, we recognize that that fundamental goal is different. Okay, briefly switching gears. We improvise all the time. When Dr. Liu is in the OR and he finds something that he doesn't expect, he does what needs to be done, obviously bounded by professionalism and best interest, but we adjust and we do things different. So the question here is, when does improvising or innovating become research? There's a number of good resources for this. I would call your attention to this ACS position statement that's actually quite old, but really makes some very nice points. And this table really goes through an algorithm that talks through exactly how we decide when innovation becomes research. There's a number of different parts of it. One relates to whether or not we are dealing with a innovation that is generating that knowledge that is going to be used for future patients versus we're just trying to take care of that individual in front of us. Has this been previously described? Are the risks and the complications proportional? And is this something that someone is consenting for separately? Has it been reviewed by a surgical innovations committee, an IRB, other registrations, FDA in certain settings, and so on? Again, this is really just to call your attention to the resource rather than to go through it in depth. But suffice to say, there are clear lines in ethics, professionalism, and surgery for where innovation and improvisation become research and what that means in terms of clinical care. And that also, again, applies to when you're doing something with a device in the operating room versus when you're using AI for clinical care direction. I do want to change gears a little bit and talk about the current political landscape with two specific points. One is that the acting U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia sent a letter to a number of different journal editors, specifically looking at how professional journals are being regulated, how their decisions for peer review are being made, and what, if any, political calculations are going into the decisions that they are making. This letter has engendered some common responses from the journals that receive it, including Annals of Surgery, Thoracic Oncology journals, Cancer, and the New England Journal of Medicine. This is still evolving as we speak. The next point actually happened today, which is that the Secretary of Health and Human Services, RFK Jr., put out a statement saying that corrupt, in quotes, medical journals that are being influenced by pharmaceutical industries and other political positions are not necessarily how HHS and NIH will publish and share their research findings. The implications for this are that NIH-funded researchers may not be able to publish in peer-reviewed journals outside of new journals created in-house within the federal government. That literally was announced today. What that means in practice, if it will actually happen, what that will look like from a political and legal standpoint, all remains to be seen. But that is just showing us how the conversation that we're having is not only timely, but very much likely to change over the course of the next few weeks, months, and years. Three take-homes: clinical care and clinical research are a bit different in ways that are important. Innovation and research are not the same, but surgical innovation in certain settings is considered research, and it's important to know when it is and when it is not. And finally, the current research ethics landscape is being colored by regulatory changes in the executive branch of the federal government in ways that are relevant to all of our work. Thank you, and I will stop sharing and turn it over.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schumann. That was, I think, a great introduction kind of regarding the ethics of how we conduct research. And for the remainder of this session now, we'll be discussing various ethical considerations in how we utilize artificial intelligence in both publishing and in our research. And thanks again, Dr. Schumann, for being so up to date that you literally included an article that I read like a half hour ago. So I wanted to introduce Dr. Sujit Baliga. He is an associate professor of radiation oncology at The Ohio State University. And we're looking forward to his talk.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dr. Brody. Can everyone hear me okay? Great, thanks. So I'll be talking about ethical considerations in head and neck artificial intelligence research and really try to give you an overview of a real-world artificial intelligence clinical study that we're doing in a multinational international setting, and then speak to the concept of thinking about research ethics that Dr. Schumann mentioned in the prior talk, and how we can kind of apply that to this new technology where, you know, the guidelines and guardrails are not very well defined. And so I'll spend most of my talk talking about that. These are my disclosures, of which there are only two that are relevant. First, I'm a scientific committee member on the HN-TACTIC artificial intelligence protocol that I'll be talking about, and I'm also section editor for Frontiers in Oncology. So in terms of the overall agenda, I'll broadly be talking about 5 major topics. I'm first going to give you an overview of the importance of artificial intelligence in oncology and what features really have primed the use of AI in oncology and where we can see that benefit in the next few years. I'll then give an introduction to the HN-TACTIC study, which is the first multinational international head and neck cancer artificial intelligence study evaluating how we can extract clinical data from electronic health records to develop predictive models with the assistance of artificial intelligence. I'll then talk about key ethical considerations and how a study like this can really be performed when you have to think about regulatory agencies evaluating this study from multiple different countries and perspectives. I'll then talk about, you know, how do journals evaluate artificial intelligence studies? What should be the sort of criteria that they should think about? And how can we make sure that those studies are fairly and critically reviewed and that we can really work to minimize bias. And finally, I'll talk a bit about conclusions and future directions. So as we all know, the last decade has really seen a tremendous growth in the use of artificial intelligence in medicine. And this is primarily due to significant advances in computing, the development of deep learning algorithms, and machine learning. And as we are all well aware, clinical data is extremely multifaceted and multidimensional. It involves analysis of tumor tissue, genomic data, imaging data, and electronic health records. And while these are all very distinct pieces of data, they're all intertwined to take care of our patients. And so being able to analyze these in a rational way and in a systematic way can be helpful. Obviously, the challenge is analyzing large amounts of data, which can be thousands and thousands of imaging data, charts, DICOM files. And so AI can really help assist clinicians in really synthesizing the above data to help make clinical decisions that can really benefit our patients. AI is particularly useful in oncology because, as we've all seen, response rates between patients can differ for patients who have the same type of cancer. And we're not always sure why that is, but AI can help really develop predictive models to identify what features make it more likely that a patient may respond versus not respond. And then AI can help with facilitating medical decision making by synthesizing all these different types of data streams: tumor tissue, genomic data, imaging data, and electronic health records. And I think artificial intelligence is especially helpful in real world type of research for multiple reasons. Number one, by using artificial intelligence and by using the advanced computing infrastructure, we can really analyze data from a larger number of patients, which gives us more power to answer the questions that we want to ask. Number two, we can conglomerate data from diverse patient profiles from across the globe. And so we can be sure that the conclusions that we make are relevant not just to one ethnicity or gender group or race, but to multiple. We can also analyze a higher number of variables. And we can also homogenize data in a very clear way. As we know, data from multiple institutions, different countries, are all going to be coded differently. How do we combine that data to be homogeneous so we can do analyses? And AI can really help with that. And finally, in modeling, AI can help develop robust predictive models to be able to benefit our patients. And all this really combines to allow us to develop a deeper and broader approach into real-world evidence. But as we're all aware, we have to really think about what are the ethics that we need to adhere to as we're doing artificial intelligence studies. And in head and neck cancer, we're already seeing the tremendous potential it really has to transform care. AI has been used to predict extranodal extension in head and neck cancer, which is quite critical in the treatment of HPV-associated malignancies, where we're trying to minimize the number of treatment modalities. HPV can be detected from pathology slides with the help of AI. And finally, machine learning has been shown to predict intermediate risk patients with head and neck squamous cell carcinoma who can benefit from adjuvant chemoradiation. Nevertheless, it's really critical to understand the potential risk and ethical considerations when adopting a new technology. And as I said before, AI-specific ethical challenges are really important to address to reduce the risk of bias. So these are some of the key ethical concerns that we need to think about as we're deploying AI. Number one is data protection and privacy. As we're all well aware, sharing large repositories of data come with the risk of data leaks. We also know of ransomware attacks that have happened. Most recently, there was a ransomware attack on Kettering Health where data was leaked. And so we need to be really careful about how data is protected and what servers they're placed on and what the algorithm capabilities are to provide security. Number two, and really a critical one, is fairness and bias in model training and deployment. AI can only analyze as good as the actual data is. And so if the data is already biased, then all artificial intelligence will do is amplify the pre-existing biases and inequalities. And if the AI algorithm is biased towards a particular demographic group, the algorithm may be less accurate in predicting outcomes in different groups of patients. And so I really think AI really needs to be trained on diverse data sets and regularly audited. Next is informed consent and secondary data use. And I think it's really important that patients should be aware of the extent to which their data will be used and incorporated in secondary analysis. And another question to ask is, will the data that's eventually sent out, will that data potentially be sold to insurance companies who can make healthcare decisions? And these are all things that we need to critically think about, especially as we share the data with other industries that may not be academic. And then another key aspect is called explainability and clinical interpretation of findings. And what this concept is that as AI becomes more and more complex and starts to really develop these complex algorithms that we run into the risk of not being able to really understand the underlying mechanism of what the AI is doing. And so the models that we develop should be explainable to clinicians in order for them to trust in them and to be used in clinical decision making. And finally is accountability in clinical decision making. So if there's an error in an AI decision making tool that impacts clinical care, who's responsible and who really bears the burden and the risk? And all these questions need to be clearly defined. The HN Tactic study stands for Towards a Better Paradigm for Head and Neck Cancer Treatment Applying Artificial Intelligence, and it's a first-in-concept multinational study evaluating the use of AI to extract free text from the electronic health records of patients with head and neck squamous cell carcinoma. And the study will really test whether using natural language processing and machine learning can extract, organize, and analyze that unstructured data, homogenize it, and develop predictive models to help our patients. And so I think there's multiple unique benefits to this study. The study will allow us to extrapolate data from thousands of cases in a multinational setting. It'll help us build predictive models of clinical response based on big data analytics, and then also tailor the risk of disease progression at a patient level to develop individualized cancer treatment plans. Already, using this AI tool, we have analyzed 1,900 patient records to date and have even developed a few predictive models, which we will eventually be shared in a couple of abstracts coming up this year and in future publications. These are the participating hospitals. Currently, most of them, as you can see, are in Europe, including Spain, Colombia, France, Switzerland, and Germany. And we have a few that are going to be joining, including Ohio State in the United States. And I think a lot of the reasons for this is that there are significant regulatory challenges to getting this study through for many of the reasons that I mentioned before. And so it really requires collaboration, not only with the IRB to evaluate the study, but also the data and IT infrastructure teams of the universities to feel comfortable with how data is shared and protected. And on the right is just a map of the different cities and institutions participating, which was actually created using ChatGPT OpenAI. So in terms of the methods for this study, essentially the way the study works is that the data from all of the electronic health records will be de-identified and sent to Savannah Oncology's central data server. The data will be initially analyzed for quality assessment to see if the data can analyze the primary and secondary objectives. The data from the unstructured free text, the Savannah Oncology's technology will use natural language processing to understand the text and develop certain terms that can be used homogenously across the different electronic health records. This is all developed into a structured database, which is then quality checked by two physician or peer reviewers, and then the results are obtained. There are two objectives of the study. The first is to develop and define risk of recurrence of disease progression following primary curative treatment in head and neck cancer in the primary setting in both early and locally advanced disease. And then the second objective is to really identify features that predict long-term survival after immunotherapy in recurrent and metastatic head and neck squamous cell carcinoma patients. This is just the study flow and approach that I mentioned before. So again, initially all individual sites will get IRB approval. It will then be sent over for data quality assessment to make sure these primary and secondary objectives can be answered with the variables given. This will then be fed into a natural language processing model, and a model will be developed. The data will then be externally evaluated to make sure that the NLP model generated the correct variables, and then the data will be analyzed. So these are some of the ethical considerations we've had to think about as we've developed the study. So first is privacy and data anonymization. So in order to get around this, Savannah has created what's called pseudo-anonymization, which is performed individually at each site. And the company actually also has an AI tool to help anonymize data within the electronic free records and remove patient identifiers. Number two, we've worked towards reducing bias in our model, and the primary methods to do this include using data from multiple institutions and across multiple countries to minimize bias as a wide demographic is selected. And also we have access to individual patient data at an international level. And finally is transparency and explainability. So our study uses what's called an explainable artificial intelligence model. And so all the outputs are multivariable statistical in nature so that physicians and investigators can understand those outputs. And then finally, we make use of this new technology or new algorithm called a Shaley additive explanation, which is essentially shows how each variable fits into the overall model and how powerful each variable is to the contribution of the overall model, so you can understand how those are contributing and be able to identify any biases using that approach. So now, we're talking about these studies. How should journals sort of evaluate AI studies? Because this is sort of a new frontier. So I think, first of all, AI research needs to be very critically evaluated, and journal editors must ensure there is transparency and help minimize bias. And so editors should and reviewers should adopt rigorous criteria to evaluate the technical and clinical aspects of AI. So this includes adherence to reporting standards, and I've included a few of those here, including Tripod AI, Consort AI, Spirit AI, and Decide AI, all for the way that we should standardly evaluate AI studies. And then finally, we should enforce transparency in model development. So this includes explanation of pre-processing steps, justification for model choice and architecture, and disclosure of the parameters, training procedures, and selection criteria that are used. And so finally, really want to assess fairness and bias. So need to make sure that the algorithm is evaluated across subgroups, across race, gender, age. We should evaluate sources of algorithm bias. And finally, the data should be validated. So there should be external validation across institutions, time periods, populations. And we should always report the sensitivity, specificity, area under the curves, and decision curves. And finally, make sure that the algorithms that are being generated have actual clinical improvement metrics. So in conclusion, as we're all aware, AI is revolutionizing oncology and really offering vast computational tools to integrate complex clinical concepts and personalized treatment. HN-Tactic is really one of the first pioneering studies to use natural language processing and machine learning to analyze unstructured data, but really ethical integrity is paramount. This includes ensuring data privacy, reducing bias, and maintaining transparency. And I think collaboration and adherence to AI reporting standards will continue to drive responsible innovation and improve patient outcomes. And ongoing evaluation and explainability are really going to be key to earning trust and guiding clinical decision-making with AI. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Fascinating study and looking forward to seeing the results and kind of additional analyses. Next, we'd like to welcome Dr. Patrick Ha, who is the Chief of the Division of Head and Neck and Surgical Oncology at University of California at UCSF. And looking forward to his talk on navigating research and the ethical pitfalls and considerations required in that in publishing.
Great. Thanks, Rob. And thanks to the others, panelists, and to the organizers. I was tasked to talk about some of the ethical pitfalls and considerations within publishing and just research in general. I do have some disclosures, and large, I think maybe I'm on this panel because I am the editor-in-chief currently of Head and Neck. So a lot of these issues have come about, and I'm happy to talk about them. So we'll talk a little bit about pitfalls in terms of authorship, the submission process itself, responsibility of the PI for oversight. Touch on the use of AI, but nowhere in depth to what Dr. Valiga just mentioned. And then a little bit about peer review as well. So it's a bit of a grab bag of issues that could arise within the realm of publishing. But I want to start with maybe something positive. I mean, why do we publish? And I think we sometimes lose sight of what is the point of all this. It's not just, to get papers and, make your CV look better, but fundamentally, we're trying to disseminate information, share these things amongst the scientific community, allow ourselves to be judged, to put ourselves out there, look at our work critically. And along the way, we may get promoted and have some assessment of progress, either by our own departments, ourselves, or even to funding agencies to help support those people who they think are putting out the best work. But fundamentally, again, this is the idea is that we're trying to contribute to science, build upon knowledge, and get to a better place, and in many cases for our own patients. So, one of the first things to tackle when thinking about a research project is authorship. So what actually is an author, and how would we, conceive of ordering them, or who gets included? And so these are just some general guidelines, right? So basically, the first bullet point of, plan and contribute meaningfully to the work. We could just stop right there. But sometimes the devil's in the details of like, well, what counts as doing work? So whether that's actually, working on the study design, uh, performing the collection of data, if there's experiments to be done, looking at the data, in an interpretive fashion, even designing figures or kind of assembling the data in a meaningful way is all helpful and and contributes. Writing the draft certainly, or helping with revisions. And then, another component is actually approving the final version. You're actually putting your name on this. And so whatever the final, stamp is that it's important to look at it, review it, make sure that you agree. And if there's any questions, then you need to talk with the other authors. So again, all these are important steps to considering like who is an author. In terms of the order, we sort of have a way that we have thought of this. And to me and to many, I think the lead author is the person who did most of the work. And generally speaking, this is the person who wrote the draft. I say first draft because obviously there can be iterations, right? As people transition, maybe there's revisions to be done and someone else picks up, and so it can get a little bit messy. We understand this. But certainly you can also share that lead authorship, and that's an option for times when maybe there's people who seemingly dually contributed, especially over time. And in general, the co-authors then, as you go down the list, have contributed a little bit less in decreasing order, except for towards the end. And the last author, or a couple of last authors, are either corresponding or senior authors. Those are the folks who have really been the overseers, and provided funding. And I think the idea is that you put yourself last because you ended up doing a lot of the work, but it's sort of like you're the anchor. And then the other thing is that you can have industry partners as contributors as well. So sometimes there's studies that may be partially funded or part of the work was done by an industry partner, and that's okay. In fact, it's better to indicate that rather than try to hide that. And then in terms of, dealing with issues, part of the problem I think comes when people may have conflicts about what position they are, or they're first, or they did the most work. And this is where establish this early, even before the work begins. So as you're conceiving of the project, the current group that you have, talk it over, and so that people understand, and they'll sort of apportion their time and contributions accordingly, so that there's no confusion at the end. Okay, so what are some pitfalls? We talked a little bit about the dispute about order or contribution. Again, I think the advice is to deal with that early and upfront, and it may change. So as the experiments, some become less or more important. It would be important to discuss that as you go. So ghost authorship is where you leave people out, where you kind of have that industry person did a lot of work, but you didn't want to mention it. So you kind of put the data in, but you don't include them because maybe it looks bad. Maybe they're controversial or something like that. But no, if they did work, contributed, you should include them. Along a similar line, but maybe on the opposite side, is guest authorship, where people who really didn't do anything, but their name's on there for various reasons. And I think we all know why that can happen. But the idea is that, please, if you're kind of seemingly the guest, at least review the paper, look it over, right? Get engaged, make comments, and come up with some ideas. And then that turns you from a guest author into a legitimate author. Again, we talked a little about revisions and when you add authors in, and again, that's okay. All journals have a mechanism for adding authors, but sometimes it does seem like guest authors can sometimes get included as something gets accepted, and people sort of start putting in more names. But again, you want to make sure they contributed meaningfully. And then changes in authorship. This comes up to that anytime there is that, everyone needs to sign off to say we agree, and they understand the role of the new people who are being added onto the paper. And then ultimately, the principal investigator has the final say. So again, this is part of that the responsibility of being the last author is to be able to be an arbiter for any problems. Okay, now you submit it, and so what are some of the things that could happen? I'd like to think that most of the times this is not, it's sort of an oversight or just not really understanding the rules. But dual submission, for example, is when you might take the same article and go, okay, it can go to these three journals, seem like they're pretty good ones to fit. I'm just going to submit to all of them, and see which one happens first, because we know that a lot of times there's delays in reviewing. You're under some time pressure. Your PI is telling you to hurry up, get this published, for a grant or for the end of your time with them. This is wrong. Okay, so you should not be submitting to the same article to multiple places. It does add to the overall journal review burden. Certainly they're going to get now 3x peer reviewers to try to look at that work. And when you submit, you are actually generally checking off a box saying, I've not submitted this anywhere else. This is, like almost like copyrighted material that I'm sending to you. So please don't do this. And if it is found out, then there are sometimes some penalties that can occur, that you can be banned from journals. And certainly people are aware that this happens. And when they do, it's just not a great sign of ethical conduct in science. Now, redundant publication. Now, this is if you actually literally take almost the same work and submit it to another journal, that's seemingly in a different field where it may not get uncovered until later. That is completely unethical. So if they've already been published, please do not submit it to another journal, thinking that, oh, it's a different readership. Nowadays, everything's online. So when they do a search, they can find you, they can find the authors, they can get the information that they need. So there's no need to submit it to a different journal, thinking that you're going to hit like a different, group of people that might be interested in it. Then it gets a little, maybe harder to parse out here, like subsets. So in other words, you have this database that you've carefully collated, you do one analysis on it, and it seems like there's a significant finding that you want to highlight. Then there's another little element that you find kind of on the side. Same data set, similar finding, but in your mind, it's different. So you create two separate publications. You can almost create the same introduction and conclusion, perhaps. But this, I think, requires judgment. And sometimes as editors, we have to look at this and kind of parse that out. I think that the main thing is that the analysis should be different. No figure should really be the same. Different focus, different conclusion. And I think also importantly, then cite the other publication, so that people are aware that this data set is out there for a different purpose, but that, you're using it for what you think to be a different analysis. Okay, so this gets to PI oversight. And so the beginning and the end is really with the PI. And so for those of you out there who are PIs, it's important to have, a real handle on what research is happening under your purview. So you should be overseeing the physical, like the actual research that's being done, the analyses, the research teams, and then importantly, all these other aspects in this bullet point with fairness and the IRB, privacy. This is all very important. As Andy mentioned, sometimes these can have actual legal implications. So, you should understand that what might seem just like something you don't have to really pay attention to could actually have consequences. And really, the last bullet point is a point that, a lot of things require communication. And I think many times, seemingly unethical events occur, mostly because people don't know. And so trainees, students, and folks under the guidance of a good PI will understand what those rules are as they go. And a lot of things, I think, can be preempted by some oversight and communication. Okay, I'm just going to sort of breeze through the AI part, and I'm not an expert in AI, so this is like the very simple things, okay? So it's okay to use AI to check for errors like in your language and to increase, the legibility of your work. It helps you avoid self-plagiarism so that if you have another article, because, head and neck squamous cell carcinoma is the most common cancer, or the fifth most common cancer in the world, like all those parts that you write every time, you can actually avoid self-plagiarism by using AI to word it in a way that is somewhat different but conveys the same information. There are closed versions of AI that you can use, and certainly at UCSF and other institutions, they have internal versions so that when you're proofreading, for example, one of your own original works, that's not getting uploaded, a non-peer-reviewed article is not getting uploaded to the general AI cloud to actually kind of taint that data, perhaps. And then the important part is just disclose when you use AI within the manuscript. If you use it to help with the grammar, that's fine. But it's best to just say, hey, this is what I did, and there won't be any consequence to that. It's really more if you try to hide it that there may be some issues that could arise. Also be aware that, we don't want to use AI to actually analyze your own data. You should come up with your own conclusions and, can be an adjunct, but it shouldn't be the mainstay of your research project. Note that it can sometimes generate false references. And then, again, if you have any questions, you can always look up your journal policies. I will say that many journal policies are pretty new and maybe not well formed. But take a look at the website if there's any question of what you're doing with AI. Okay, now on the flip side, right? So we're thinking about submitting stuff, but what if you're on the receiving end of it? And what are the ethical considerations? And so, I think that the first step is sometimes you're asked to review an article, and it may be blinded, in which case that's a little bit easier, but many of them are not. So you can see the author list and basically think about what conflicts that might exist fundamentally, even if those people you haven't published with them or don't have a grant together, or aren't, hanging out every weekend from the same institution. There are sort of areas where you feel like I just can't be unbiased because I'm such a big fan of so and so, and I don't think I can, give a tough review. Don't review it. Tell them I'm in conflict. You don't even have to say why, but just say I don't think I can give an objective review of this. But there are other aspects like we just talked about in terms of topic or author. They're your competitor. Thinking about the same, competing for funding. Anything that can introduce bias, I think it's appropriate for you to say I should not review this. Confidentiality, again, when you review, you should not be talking to someone else about, Dr. Brody's study I just read that he submitted and, how we want to do the same thing. Do not do those things, right? That's confidential. You shouldn't be using that data yourself to generate ideas, and you really shouldn't be talking to anyone else about it. If you, put it into AI to say, hey, generate a nice review for me, then it also puts it out there technically. And so that is also unethical and something you should not do. The critique should be constructive and it should not be emotional, so that you don't need to include like harsh language or really judgmental tone, because that's really not very helpful. In fact, it'll probably get changed by the editor. Do it in a timely way, because obviously those of us who submit, you want it to come back in a reasonable time, and so don't delay that. And then I think many journals have gone to more of an anonymous type of review, but keep in mind some can be open where they can see who's reviewing it, and there's kind of pros and cons to that. Okay, so I know these are kind of a grab bag of different topics, but the point is that research it's serious, right? This is people's livelihood at stake. We're really trying to take our efforts seriously and to make sure that we have the highest quality work that gets published. And that how we go about this and the rules surrounding that matter. They're there for a reason. There's all sorts of different ethical issues, and we just touched on a few. But really, the main thing is to just keep the high road, right? So be well-intentioned, do the right thing, and if you have a question, try to understand the rules. Talk to your PI. And then, as we kind of stumble through the AI component of all this, it's going to introduce new questions. So we on the journal side are doing our best to keep up to date, to try to stay reasonable about it. But we know that these processes will change over time. And really, my point is just remain optimistic. Keep in mind that most people are well-intentioned regarding this, and just let's focus on publishing good work and maintaining progress. So thanks for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ha. For the last part to close out this session will be Dr. Xiaojing Wang, who is Professor and Endowed Chair of Experimental Pathology and Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine at UC Davis. Just a reminder to our audience, the question and answer space is open. So if you have any questions or something you want to put up for the panelists, just go ahead and drop it in there. We can respond in real time, but we can also have some time for questions at the very end. Looking forward to your talk, Dr. Wang. And I think you might be muted if you're talking, Dr. Wang.
Here you go. Okay. Yeah. So my talk is related to your the end product. Oh, I try to go back. Okay, here. And the concern raised towards the publications, that can be as small as honest mistakes and can be as big as a serious scientific misconduct. This is my disclosure. And the topics are the triggers, the process, and the outcome of the concerns are raised. So related to the topic I'm discussing here, I'm the editor-in-chief for molecular carcinogenesis. That is a scientific Journal for Cancer Research established 1980s, and currently we have several head and neck cancer research scientists are on the editorial board. First, the triggers, and over 90% of the triggers are related to image suspicions. And again, these could be either honest mistake or fabrication, falsified data. The second category is reported results that opposite to readers' findings. So the readers start to dig into the details and found out the wrong methods that leads to the wrong conclusion, or the methods that they would not be able to reproduce. For example, if you put a wrong primer and then they use that sequence could not really reproduce your data, or the antibody pattern is not the same. And then they start to raise the concern. The third category, and as Dr. Ha just mentioned, plagiarism. Right now, because we have the screening, it's less. And what overlooked is so-called self-plagiarism. And sometimes you put methods from publication A, and then now you're working on publication B, you put the method as cup holder, but forgot to double check. And then that sometimes created issue. There are several categories that rendered absolute retraction, so no excuse. First is called paper mill, and paper mills usually refer there's no real data, and it's just one set of data get copy paste into another. For example, one microRNA in GI cancer, and then somebody, either the writing firm or medical writers write another one, just say the same microRNA, same targets into head and neck, and then without any original data. So that's called paper mill. The second is the duplicated publication, and Dr. Patrick Howe just mentioned. In my tenure, I actually encountered one duplicated publication. One is in molecular carcinogenesis, another in cancer. So we have to retract it for this. And then the third, now related to AI, this is very new. Mainly it's the AI generated publication. Then when you screen it, it's all AI language, and then you go back to the author, ask the author's draft. The author doesn't have any drafts, so that's also rendered retraction. The process, usually the concerns are raised directly to the publishers, and some of them could also get into the institutional level. Publisher generally gave benefit of doubt to the corresponding author and ask for original data for the correction. Is this honest mistake? If there's no response, or if the allegation is really serious, the publisher can go directly to the institution of the corresponding author. Then the institution will start the investigation process. If the institution finds the evidence of scientific misconduct, they are obligated to report to the funding agency. And then the remaining funding and future funding are all stripped. You also would have a restriction that you're not eligible to apply new grants. So all these are pretty serious in a way. And then this is an example of how image checking. First, I need to make it clear, this is not example of the retraction example, and also for the sake of the confidentiality, I took out all the labels and basically just to show you how this works. And on top, the author claimed these are the four different groups of the study. And then the bottom are the imaging checking. And obviously through the checking, the number 1, the number 4 groups are identical. So in that case, this could be a very simple mistake, honest mistake, just copy paste and oops, here's a duplicated image. Or could be as serious as there's no group 4 and it's just made it up, right? And in this case, it's go back to the author to show that the 4 groups indeed exist. Another example of the imaging checking can be either nothing here or can be more serious. So on your right side, there are 2 groups of the study and with the same markers for Western blots. Then the 2 studies are different, but on the right side, the 2 columns for the comparison of image, you can see that only the first column, only 3 of them are almost overlap or extremely similar. So in that case, it could be that your original blocks are just as similar as what you showed here. But on the other hand, if you don't have the raw data, you would not be able to prove that the 3 orange box bands are not engineered. So if they're engineered, they got to be copy pasted into those because the rest of the bands are different. So that'll create serious issue. And that's the reason that why your original data is always very important. Then the last piece of the process is how the authors would respond. The bottom line is if scientific conclusion holds true, because this affects the entire scientific field. So that'll divide the response either as correction or retraction. And correction, the most common one are to specify where or how the honest mistake was introduced. Then when in the correction also publish the original data to show that this is behind your scientific conclusion. And the second category could be if you cannot find your original data, especially if it's past 7 years of status of limitation, and then state if scientific conclusions are supported by other figures in the same manuscript or other publications from outside that already reproduced your data. The third one, I saw that 2 examples that if original data cannot be found, and then the authors chose to find independent labs to reproduce the data, and so then they can prove scientific conclusion hold true, and then publish the validation data. You can imagine that this is lengthy and costly, but the authors chose this way to guard their scientific reputation. Retraction, the most common retraction type is that the evidence of scientific misconduct are identified, then so that statement needs to specify the nature and the author involved for the falsified data, and then state all authors, co-authors agree to retract. The second possibility is that the authors cannot find original data to prove either way. And so because if they cannot guard the conclusion holds true, they can only retract it, say it's inconclusive. The third one is nothing was wrong, but the limitation of the technology and method used, for example, 10 years ago, is very different from the technologies we have now. And then the author figured that, the conclusion is wrong. And at the time they thought it was right, but now it seems wrong. So this kind of retraction actually will show your own scientific and ethical integrity. So not all retractions are bad. And for all these, you would say, okay, we never do bad things. But again, in co-author list, it takes only one person to do some bad things, right? So the proactive tips, first, the most important thing is to keep your original data. And I keep telling my trainees, backup, backup, backup. The easy way to do is when you do your final submission after like several revisions, then you have your final figure panels, organize the original data using the panels, and then cross-check between the figure panel and your original data. That way you can actually catch the honest or avoid honest error. The second is usually the statistics tells you a lot. So carefully check that. Give you the example. If you have a very small size of the study, has huge standard deviation, but p-value is 0.005, and then that'll actually raise the flag to yourself, say, wait a minute, this is not possible. And then so you go back, check your raw data. Third is carefully review the methods and to make sure it's error-free. And most of the authors are quite conscientious. Double check the figures. Methods may be the last thing they check. But that's what I just mentioned is the vulnerable area to raise the red flags. Then lastly is this is an overlook that make sure you avoid citations that including retracted publications. And because if those publications get cited reference from your paper, it can raise the serious concern whether your paper is designed rationale based on this retracted publication. This happens in a quite rapid progression of the publication, that maybe your publication, the first draft till the last draft, it like a year and a half or 2 years between the two. At the beginning, there's no retracted publication, but at the end, they are. So be very careful for that. So with that, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Wong. That was really a nice summary, sort of peeling back the curtain of what it looks like on the editorial side, looking at potential deep fakes within the research space and exactly how that process unfolds. We are just like 60 seconds short of 8 o'clock. So first I want to thank all of our panelists and my co-moderator, for their time today. I think we covered a lot of ground, and also I think hopefully covered got a chance to dive into some of the topics around, how research is in 2025, at least May of 2025, because you never know, just in a couple weeks with everything going on, what it might look like in the near future. I did want to bring attention to the chat, and just to put it out, since this is being recorded, that there was a nice question by Leda Morales asking a great question about using AI models. When you use AI models to explain data and you get a result, how do you make sure that those models are accurate when it's hard to sort of peel back and understand how the AI came up with the results? And as a result of that, Sujith, I see your response here, but if you want to give like a human intelligence summary of your online response, what do you think?
Yeah,
Some?
no, I think it's an absolutely a great question, because when we think about a lot of the sort of tumors that we treat in head and neck, when you just think about HPV, positive tumors more likely to be correlated to be tumors that are in the oropharynx. So you have to be very careful when this happens, because you have variables that are sort of related to each other. And so when you're trying to make causal inferences, when you have that kind of modeling, you have what's called overfitting, where the final conclusion may not be correct because you already have two things related to each other that are in the initial predictive model. And so what I just mentioned, and it was a great question, is that you shouldn't only rely on using the SHAP feature, and that there are other tools that can sort of help you find out where these collinearities lie. And I kind of mentioned what some of those tools are. But we also have to remember at the end of the day that we can't over rely on artificial intelligence, and that we have to use our clinical judgment and reasoning to really critically evaluate these models and make sure they still make clinical sense and make sense in the clinical context of the patients that we treat. And so I think even things like including head and neck experts early within the model and having them really look at the modeling and make sure that it makes clinical sense is really important as well.
Great, thanks for that. And then just one more question, which I thought was really excellent. It was from Rohan Walvikar. That as AI data mining evolves, there are some clinical methodologies that might become obsolete, and he brings up this idea of that retrospective studies, right? You used to go and sort of mine the chart, collect all the data. Well, in the future, if that chart is available to the AI, and AI can just pop the question and give you the answer almost in real time, will such research become obsolete? Does anybody have an opinion on that? I'd be interested to hear.
I think if you look at the most recent technology that Google's putting out, where they're making their own videos, and you're kind of almost, content's just constantly created that's AI generated. I think that the same kind of philosophy could be applied here, where I think that at the end of the day, we still need to keep creating our own data. We have to keep mining our own data in a way that allows us to input that data in a way that can be abstracted. And so even though you might be able to use an AI algorithm to use natural language processing to extract data out, you still have to put that data in, whether you're doing it through an AI scribe or whether you're kind of talking to the patient one-on-one to get their information, or getting it from them through a patient-reported outcome measure. So I'm looking forward to seeing how we kind of partner with these technologies to get better patient data and more reliable patient data.
Thank you, Dr. Brody. I'll close with one more comment on that, because I do find it a fascinating question. If you look at the way AI works, it's predictive, it's generative, but it kind of wants to make you happy. So the problem is that if you ask questions that you kind of know what you want, it's going to kind of read that intent in the way you ask your question, and it might give you data and results that are going to feed that, but may not be actually accurate. And so I think when we start to use these tools, we have to be very careful about how the data is generated, some sort of audit process to make sure that it's true, and to be able to still be surprised when the data says something else, and be able to take that at face value. At the end of the day, the AI is not telling us how to be, but is a sort of a co-pilot. I'm not a Microsoft person, but just like a co-pilot or a co-intelligence or co-partner to help you in this process of research. So I don't really see these traditional strategies going away, but I do find that we can engage, like retrospective studies going away, these kind of studies to go away. But I do see that maybe we can have better tools to help us mine this information more quickly. In the days of plowing through 1,000 charts with your medical student, or being a medical student applying to 1,000 charts. I think we can do things a lot better than that. So that's my final comment. I think we're out of time, and so I want to thank again all our panelists and my co-moderator, Dr. Brody. Thank you all for being here, and have a wonderful evening.